On March 4, 2002, 6 Navy SEALs and a combat controller were airlifted by helicopter on the snow-covered ridge of Takur Ghar Mountain in eastern Afghanistan. Their mission was to rescue a comrade who had fallen from the rear ramp during an earlier landing attempt. But as soon as the soldiers got out of the helicopter, all hell broke loose. From several directions at once, they came under heavy machine gun fire. Nevertheless, the combat controller, John Chapman, fought his way valiantly uphill through a thick layer of snow and attacked the enemy until he was hit and remained motionless on the ground. In order to not lose any more men, the team leader ordered the remaining soldiers to fall back to the Chinook and leave the kill zone. But as the helicopter disappeared into the darkness, a surveillance drone that remained over the battlefield captured something incredible. Chapman had suddenly regained consciousness and, despite his wounds, engaged the enemy on his own. What followed next was to become one of the most courageous acts of the entire Afghanistan war. The 7-member team was on a mission of setting up an observation post at night on the 10,000-foot mountain to support Operation Anaconda. In this operation, about 2,000 soldiers from different nations fought against Taliban and al-Qaeda forces to drive them out of southeastern Afghanistan. Even before the mission, the soldiers had to deal with technical problems and had to change helicopters at short notice. In addition, they were under enormous time pressure due to the soon rising sun to set up the observation post in time. According to military principles, they would have landed at a safe distance and approached the reconnaissance target on foot so as to not alert any enemies who might be lying in wait. But since an AC-130 had scanned the area with thermal vision shortly before and could not detect any enemies, the leader of the reconnaissance team decided to land directly on the mountain. This circumstance was to have fatal consequences for the course of the mission only a short time later. Under a thick snow cover, well-equipped and trained insurgents had hidden in bunkers and took such heavy fire on the approaching Chinook that electronics failed and a fire broke out. While the pilots were trying to get the helicopter back in the air, an RPG tore through the rear of the Chinook, causing Navy SEAL Neil Roberts to lose his grip and fall out of the rear ramp in the chaos. Recovery of the soldier was impossible since the helicopter was badly damaged, so the team decided to make an emergency landing about 6 miles away. They then switched to a new Chinook before voluntarily flying back into the danger zone to rescue their comrade. As soon as the team reached Takur Ghar Mountain, they again came under heavy machine gun fire, but nevertheless got off the helicopter and took up positions. Due to icy snowfields and gradients of up to 70 degrees, the enemy clearly had the upper hand. But Chapman did not let this stop him and wanted to rescue Roberts at all costs. First, he called in air support from an AC-130 and then fought his way alone through the snow to one of the bunkers where he killed 2 enemies at close range. He then attacked another bunker together with his squad leader, but was badly hit and collapsed. The soldiers fought bravely, but the entrenched enemy had a clear advantage, both tactically and in numbers. When yet another team member was shot, the squad leader realized that further action would only result in more casualties and decided to leave the mountain again. As the SEALs fought their way back to the helicopter, they overlooked the motionless Chapman in the darkness and left him behind. None of the exhausted soldiers had any idea at the time that this was only the beginning of one of the most serious battles American soldiers would experience in Afghanistan. A CIA surveillance drone had appeared over the battlefield in the meantime and kept an eye on the enemies even after the Navy SEALs withdrew. But then the drone operator noticed something unusual. In the middle of the kill zone, a previously lifeless person suddenly moved. It was Chapman, who had regained consciousness despite his wounds and had not yet given up the fight with the insurgents. At least one of the 2 hits he had suffered so far should have been fatal, which made the following scenes even more incredible. As Chapman oriented himself in the darkness, he tried to reach surrounding forces with his radios. Indeed, a friendly combat controller and some special forces stationed nearby heard Chapman, but their responses did not get through to him. Meanwhile, at least 24 hostiles also realized that not all the Americans had left the mountain and engaged Chapman again. Although he was already suffering from considerable blood loss, Chapman successfully fought off an onrushing insurgent but was again wounded by enemy fire and shrapnel. A second onslaught by the desperate insurgents resulted in hand-to-hand combat, in which Chapman emerged victorious despite his wounds. Meanwhile, a quick reaction force of 19 airborne rangers, a tactical air controller, and 3 pararescue jumpers headed to the mountain. When Chapman heard the helicopter at dawn, he had the decision to either stay in his partially covered position and hope for an early rescue, or to provide cover fire for his comrades in the air so they could land safely. Chapman chose the latter, and though he had been fighting and surviving on his own for so long, he charged toward the enemy one last time to draw fire. With only 2 rounds left in his weapon, and after 16 shrapnel and gunshot wounds, Chapman finally suffered a final hit to the heart and died. Meanwhile, the quick reaction force's Chinook had come under such heavy fire that one door gunner was killed and both pilots were seriously wounded. In a heroic maneuver, they managed to make a relatively safe emergency landing at the last second under severe RPG and machine gun fire. Although the insurgents fired at the rear ramp with tremendous firepower, the Rangers charged out of the Chinook, some of them being fatally shot upon exiting. They then fought their way through 3 feet of snow, up a hill with a 45 to 70 degree incline, while simultaneously being fired upon from extended, elevated positions with heavy machine guns and mortars. Hundreds of enemy fighters had entrenched themselves in the mountain range and were now drawn in by the noise of battle. The tactical air controller called in close airstrikes several times, and evacuation of the wounded by helicopter was impossible due to the intense enemy fire. It took hours for the American forces to finally gain the upper hand, evacuate all the wounded, and finally exfiltrate around 8 p.m. local time. In total, 7 U.S. soldiers lost their lives during the battle, and 12 others were wounded. 2 advanced Chinook helicopters with ground radar were lost. On the other side, approximately 200 enemy fighters were taken out during the hours of fighting, showing the sheer mass against which the American soldiers had to fight. Unfortunately, it turned out that Navy SEAL Neil Roberts, who fell from the helicopter at the beginning, probably survived the crash and was executed by insurgents shortly before the team returned. However, a final statement on the exact cause of death was never given. John A. Chapman had initially received the Air Force Cross, the Air Force's second highest award for his actions during the Battle of Takur Ghar. However, Deborah Lee James, Secretary of the Air Force, advocated for an upgrade to the Medal of Honor after a reanalysis of the CIA drone footage. The Marine Command tried to prevent that, since it would mean admitting that Chapman was alive at the time of the evacuation and that an American soldier had been left behind on the mountain. However, Chapman's heroic actions could not be ignored, and he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor in August 2018, as well as promoted to Master Sergeant. A brotherhood that no one else could ever understand.
Bright